Democrats in Congress stand by to authorize more aid for Ukraine and its people if needed as this conflict wears on? I don't hear the. I think we have lost sound with the congressman, but I believe that I believe we'll go to break and try. Okay, we got the congressman back. We do not need to go to break. I'm going to help produce this part. Let's go to the congressman. He's with us now.
Well, I said thank you very much for having me on this Resurrection Day. Yes, we are very much involved in this conflict or this war. And I tend to agree with President Biden that we see genocide taking place here. You may recall back in March when we were down in Selma. I remember very well over in Montgomery as we were about to leave, several of those what we call foot soldiers saying to me, "We appreciate all the work you're doing, trying to obtain voting rights, trying to protect the Voting Rights Act. But you've got to do what's necessary to stop Putin. If you don't, there's not going to be anything here for us to vote for. This democracy will come to an end." And that's coming from people who fought so hard back in the early 1960s, trying to get the right to vote, trying to be a part of this democracy, now saying we must put priority on protecting this democracy. So not just the Democrats, but the American people are behind President Biden to do what is necessary to protect Ukraine.
Now, Congressman, Democrats have just a few months left before they just have a few months left to even pass additional legislation before the midterm elections. What has leadership learned from the demise of the Build Back Better Act? Can you get a stripped down version passed through reconciliation, even with the war in Ukraine and election season politics eating up much of the oxygen on Capitol Hill? Can you get something finished, even if it's piece by piece, in terms of Build Back Better?
Yes, I think we can, and I think we will. The fact of the matter is we've already heard that the compromise is not just on the table, but is attainable on such things as climate change. We've heard that we are pretty much together on trying to put a ceiling on the cost of pharmaceuticals. We've already passed in the House recently a cap on insulin to $35 a month. So those things are contained in what we were calling Build Back Better, but we are going to put together a Building a Better America, and it's going to have much of this in it. There's one thing that I'm working hard on, I hope we can get in it, and that is get legislation to protect the electoral count. And in that legislation, we ought to do what is necessary to apply what we call pre-clearance to all 50 states. If we get that and nullify the ability or the process of nullifying votes, I think that we will attain a great deal for the American people.
Now, this week we learned inflation hit a 40-year high, and the nation's largest online retailer, Amazon, slapped a 5% fuel and inflation surcharge on its online sellers, which will mean higher prices for consumers and smaller profits for small business people. I don't need to tell you, Congressman, that when prices go up, it's working class families of color and people living paycheck to paycheck that get hurt first. What can Democrats do to help?
Well, I think the president has done some things when he's tapped into our oil reserve. I do believe that we are going to get some movement on that issue as well. Now, gasoline's tax on gasoline, I think we ought to be able to get a carve out according to what kind of work people do, so that people in rural communities, people who rely upon gasoline purchasing in order to protect their small farms, I think we can do something and get a carve out for these people. And I'm hopeful that that will be done as soon as we get back.
weekend is a special one, a moment of spiritual reflection for nearly half the world's population. For Christians such as myself, today is Easter. Meanwhile, for Jewish people, they just observed Passover. And for Muslims, we are in the midst of the holy month of Ramadan. And so far, this edition of Rise Up, for this edition, I want us to celebrate the festive time with a look at some extraordinary Americans of diverse backgrounds who made a difference this week. We lead off with the San Francisco Giants' Alyssa Natkin, who on Tuesday made Major League Baseball history as the first woman to coach on the field in regular season games. Alyssa barely had time to think when she was asked to grab a helmet and take the spot next to the first base after another coach was ejected from the game. But now that she's had time to reflect, she says it's a big deal, and it's her job now to, quote, honor those who helped me to where I am, unquote. This is a huge step for the Major League Baseball League as it works to diversify the professional staff, which is currently made up of 30% women, according to the 2021 Racial and Gender Report Card released by the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports. In Missouri, Democratic State Congressman Ian Mackey rose up on Thursday to take a brave stand against a bill targeting transgender athletes. The bill was put forward by Republicans who claim they want to save women's sports. It would have barred trans females from participating. Congressman Mackey made an emotional argument against the bill by talking about his own experiences growing up as a gay teenager.
This is what you're focused on. This is the legislation you want to put forward. This is what consumes your time. For 18 years, I walked around with nice people like you who took me to ball games, who told me how smart I was, and who went to the ballot and voted for crap like this.
The bill did eventually pass, but Congressman Mackey's powerful speech went viral the world over. And finally, there's Betty Reed Soskin, 100 years young. Betty celebrated her retirement from the National Park Service yesterday, where she had been the oldest active park ranger in the U.S. Betty didn't even start her ranger career until the age of 84. She was instrumental in sharing the stories of black workers on the home front during the World War II, while serving at the Rosie or the Riveter National Park in Richmond, California. These three individuals all came from very different backgrounds, led very different lives. But what they all have in common is they all rose up and used their experiences and talents to not only better themselves, but to improve the lives of those around them. This holiday, I urge each and every one of you to think about their stories and to strive to follow their examples. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Politics Nation. A new report from the National Urban League provides insight into everything from the economy and voting rights as it pertains to Black America and the state of Black America. This year, the index shows Black Americans only get 73.9 of what white Americans enjoy. Not much difference from the 2000 to 2005 area. There have been huge strides in categories such as economics and health, both up by several percentage points. Where the numbers dipped by nearly 10 percentage points was in social justice and civic engagement. Black Americans lost ground in these areas since 2000 to 2005, according to the report. Here to talk more about the report's findings is the president and CEO of the National Urban League, Mark Morial. Mark, let's dive right in. You and I work closely together with Urban League and National Action Network, so I don't have to do a whole runway to start with you. The State of Black America report began in 2005. This year's index shows the quality of life among Black Americans has remained relatively consistent at 73.9% compared to white Americans. Now, this figure looks at how well Black Americans are doing in comparison to whites when it comes to their economic status, their health, their education, social justice, and civic engagement. What are some hurdles in place preventing this gap from closing?
Reverend, first of all, happy Easter to you. Thank you for your partnership and your leadership. It's always good to be on Politics Nation. This report underscores the fact that the gaps in American life between blacks and whites when it comes to social and economic conditions are in a form of suspended animation, that the differential doesn't change much on an overall basis. And as you indicated, we saw modest gains in economics, modest gains in health. And I would underscore these figures are pre the COVID pandemic. So the economic gains, certainly we had a consistent economic expansion that began under Barack Obama and continued to 2020. We had the Affordable Care Act and the expansion of Medicaid. Those factors played a huge role in the change in those areas. But we've also had in the civic engagement space, and this is a key part of the report, this campaign, this plot, this effort to undermine Black and brown participation in elections. It's gerrymandering. It's the assaults on the Voting Rights Act. It's the use of the filibuster to reinstate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It is voter suppression laws by the hundreds, a deluge of voter suppression laws being, if you will, either passed or promoted or proposed in states across the nation. And that underscores why this report says that we are under siege and that there's a plot to undermine American democracy. Much of it operated beyond the strategic view of people. They saw things here and things there. What they didn't realize, I think many people didn't realize, is how orchestrated all of this was until you saw what happened on January 6th. Right. You saw what happened in this effort to allow for partisan overturning of elections. So
we're seeing now text messages and all that show that there was a very organized and coordinated effort.
No question. And we have to push back on it. And we have to insist. And I saw Congressman Clyburn on. He's been a great champion for so much. Right now, it is all about voting rights. It is all about protection of democracy. We're going into an election cycle with all of this smoke of voter suppression, the fire of gerrymandering, the effort to discredit elections officials, a campaign of big lies and subversion. And people, we're going to have to stand up, not see frustration and cynicism as a strategy or a tactic, but stand up and do everything we can to participate in this election. Without the right to vote, without the ability to sit at the table in the decision-making corridors of government, then we can't impact economics, education. We can't impact social justice and civic engagement in the way that we want. So all of these issues are tied together. And the analogy we've been using is the caboose on the train. African Americans, when it comes to many of these categories, if the American economy speeds up, certainly the unemployment rate for Black Americans goes down, but it remains at twice what it is for whites. And that's the challenge for 21st century America. So stateofblackamerica.org is where the report is. It's free. It's available. We hope people will download it. They'll take a look at it and use it for their discussions and debates, and elected officials will use it for policy making in states and locales across the nation.
Stateofblackamerica.org. Now, the report also shows that Black Americans have only modest gains in economics and health since 2000 to 2005. Right now, black wealth is up just over 5 percentage points, and health is up over 8 percentage points in the past nearly 2 decades. The Biden administration is considering one executive action that could help boost those numbers by canceling some student debt, which would make it easier for some black families to pay their bills and take out lines of credit. But with inflation looming, more must be done. What other executive actions could Biden issue to uplift the black community?
Well, I think executive actions on policing, any executive actions on voting, certainly, Reverend, to cancel as much of student debt as can be done by executive action will allow many more African-American families, Latino families to become qualified for home ownership. Student debt is one of the great barriers to many, many families qualifying for conventional 30-year mortgages. So I urge the president, to do everything in his power by executive action. But I challenge the Democrats also, because it's clear there's not going to be modest or no Republican support for much of this, to settle whatever differences they have amongst themselves, use the reconciliation process to pass whatever portions of the Build Back Better plan can be put together in a reconciliation bill, and to do it before the midterm, do it and make it a legislative priority.
Now, one of the most drastic drops highlighted in your report is social justice. That figure fell nearly 10 percentage points. The same for civic engagements as well. The social justice statistic includes traffic stops, interaction with police, and the use of force by officers. The civil engagement piece takes into account voting, community participation, and collective bargaining. This also comes as the Washington Post reports over 1,000 people were shot and killed by police last year alone. Right now, we're following the case of Patrick Lyoya in Grand Rapids, Michigan. What do you think is behind the drop in the fight for social justice and civic engagement? How do you interpret these numbers, Mark?
I think there's been a bit of a backlash in American life. I think Trumpism is part of that backlash. Certainly, whenever you get a spike in gun violence in America, sometimes people believe that the criminal justice system needs to engage in crackdown efforts versus responsible, sensible reform efforts. And it is troubling, Reverend, that this challenge of unarmed black men particularly being shot and killed by the police remains unabated. You and I worked hard on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Once again, the Senate filibuster thwarted that act when we had an opportunity, I think, to go on record and do something. Would the George Floyd bill solve all these problems? No, but it is important that the Congress go on record saying that they're going to take a stand against unfair police misconduct, the killings of unarmed black men, and put some tools in the hands of the Justice Department and private citizens in the civil justice system to recompense families so that there's a remedy and some accountability when these things occur. And I want to remind people that this is not inconsistent with efforts to tamp down, to confront the spike in gun violence that we have in America today. The last thing we need to do is make the mistakes of the 80s, when we had, in the 90s, when we had spikes in gun violence, right, and people ran to just increase penalties, crack down and do more arrests for minor crimes. That will not work. There needs to be a better, more sensible approach, and we can, as a nation and as local communities, do all of these things in concert with each other and together.
Yeah, there must be the balance, public safety as well as criminal justice reform. Mark, one of the things that strikes me about your report is that black people are resilient. They are progressively making strides despite constant pushback. But as you know, right now, at least 19 states have passed new restrictive voting legislation. According to the Brennan Center, with the midterm months away, What can Black Americans do to make sure their voices are heard?
Right now, in face of these barriers, we have to make voting in the midterm the highest of high priorities. We need to be registered. We need to double check our registration. We need to make sure everyone in our household, in our family, in our social circles, our churches, our civic clubs are registered to vote. We need to understand what the limitations, the restrictions, the new rules are in your state. We need to come together to push back, if we can, against those rules, but to otherwise vote in large numbers. If we have to take the day off, if we can take the day off from working on election day to make sure that we can stand in lines, because they're going to be long lines, we have to do that. Whatever it takes, we have to stand up and we must vote.
Mark Morial, thank you for being with us on
Thank
this
you, Reverend.
Easter. My political panel is next. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Politics Nation. Let's bring in my political panel. Joining me now is Democratic strategist Michael Hardaway and Republican strategist Rina Shah. Thank you both for joining me today on Easter. Now, it's been 52 days since Putin invaded Ukraine. The United States and its European allies have begun coordinating on a new strategy to isolate Russia from the rest of the international community. But, Michael, there's also the issue of unity here at home. A number of right-wing Republicans in Congress have actually voiced support for Russian President Vladimir Putin. How big a problem do you think that is?
Well, it shocks the conscience of one's imagination that in the middle of such horrific war crimes being put forth by Vladimir Putin, that anyone, much less an American, much less an elected official in America, would support and do what they've done over the past few weeks, which is show that they put their party above their country. And I think that's shameful. I think it's horrific. But I think ultimately, if you look at the polling across America and both parties, the majority of Americans support this president and his actions to bring justice to Vladimir Putin, notwithstanding the empty stoop policies and actions of the Republican Party.
Now, Rina, I want to get your thoughts about the moves made by this week by two high-profile Republican governors. On Friday, Texas Governor Greg Abbott had to give up on a policy of inspecting commercial trucks near the U.S.-Mexico border after a week of backlash over backed-up traffic and fears about the economic impact. And in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has been pushing to take over the redistricting process and draw maps Democrats say are overtly racist and aimed at protecting Republican power. In both of these cases, these GOP governors seem to be trying to play by their own rules. I mean, what's going on here?
Reverend, they've taken the mask off for all of America to see. There was a time over these past couple of years where both these governors of Texas and Florida, massive states in our country, not to be discounted, had been actually applauded for their leadership during the pandemic. There were moments that looked promising and hopeful that perhaps the Republican Party nationally could turn a corner if we looked at the leadership of some of these governors. When I say they've taken the mask off, it's clear they're playing political games, games that show us that they want to make Americans in their state suffer so that they can make Democrats look bad. This is all about making Democrats look like they are the ones driving up inflation, when it's in fact Governor Abbott who did it this past week by creating supply chain issues at, for example, Laredo, Texas, the nation's largest inland port that does billions in business of exports and imports. This is clearly the governor's end goal, is to really say, if the Democrats doing this to you, I will save you in the midterms, keep us red, vote us red, and don't go blue. And so what we really need to see here is the games that have clearly been so cool to so many of us, because they're not just affecting our wallet, they're affecting our livelihoods. And it is so sad and so shameful. So there needs to be a clear rejection of DeSantis as well. When we talk about Texas and Florida, we need to tell the truth about what these governors are doing
Now-
and what their end goal is.
Now, Michael, what's your take on these Republican governors?
Well, it's horrifying. You have a state in Florida where you have a significant number of COVID deaths and cases. This governor is doing nothing to address that. You have a state in Texas where there's significant economic problems in that state, where you have nearly 40% of rural Texans who say that their local economy is terrible. And so these governors should be doing something to help their constituents versus making their lives harder, letting food spoil on the highway, letting all these things fall by the wayside. Meanwhile, average everyday Americans are suffering because of these horrific policies. And frankly, if you look at a guy like DeSantis, he clearly would do anything to make it to the White House in 2024.
Yeah.
He'll copy Donald Trump in every single capacity that he can. And frankly, I don't think the voters will fall for it.
Now, on Friday, former President Donald Trump, as you just mentioned his name, Friday he officially endorsed hillbilly elegy author J.D. Vance in Ohio's crowded Senate Republican primary, calling him, quote, the candidate most qualified and ready to win in November. Rena, political kingmakers don't normally make their biggest endorsements on Friday afternoons ahead of a holiday weekend. And we know not everyone in Trump's world is excited about J.D. Vance. What's your take on the former president's latest pick and his influence on the Republican Party headed into the midterm primary season?
I think we know that Donald Trump is unconventional in every way, so we shouldn't read too far into what this endorsement means, because this is a total jungle in this Ohio race. What we've been seeing is the monkeys emerging, and the monkeys being these outlandish candidates that say things and do things that are not just offensive by sort of political conventional wisdom, but they really are almost in a race to see who's going to be zanier and just sound better for Trump's base of vote. And so inevitably, the former president had to make an endorsement. There's no doubt about it. He had to do it. Was it going to be Mandel? Was it going to be Vance? I think he went with whatever his gut told him at the last minute. It's important to note, though, that Donald Trump was never a conservative. He was always a populist. Rush Limbaugh himself said that. And so when you see Vance say certain things, now it kind of makes more sense why he went with Vance over Mandel.
Michael, Politico's out today with an article on Vice President Harris's recent trip. She has recently been in Greenville, Mississippi, and Louisiana, speaking to overlooked communities about what their concerns are. Vice President Harris faced some criticism for her performance early in her term, some of it unfairly. Do you think she has made moves to turn things around?
She's doing the right thing, which is she's getting out of Washington and she's going to where the people are. And as you stated earlier, the elites have sort of attacked her in a number of different capacities that are both unfair and unreasonable. But I think that she's taken a lead in going out to the people in the South and in rural America and in urban America and really advocating for the policies of this president and making clear that this president and this administration have been fighting for those people. She's doing the right thing there. And I would say to you that inside of the White House, she's also been working incredibly hard in terms of taking meetings along with the president with other world leaders who have been coming to Washington to meet on Russia and a number of other issues. So she's been doing the hard work. The elites may not like her, but I think the people like her, and that's what's most important.
Yeah, she's definitely been on the world stage and moving around the country. Michael Haraway, Harder Day, and Rena Shah, thank you both for being with us on Easter. Up next, my final thoughts. As we continue to cover the war in Ukraine, I want to highlight some of the important stories that you may have missed. That doesn't get lost in the fog of war. The Biden-Harris administration announced on Thursday a government-wide action plan that would advance racial equity across 19 federal agencies. The announcement is the start of President Biden fulfilling his executive order that he signed on his first day of office. He mentioned that the plans laid out by the administration must not be seen as a one-year project, but as a generational commitment. Vice President Harris is pushing to make Black maternal health a national health priority. In the first led cabinet meeting, she pointed out the high rates of maternal mortality in the U.S., as well as statistics showing a high disproportionate death among racial minorities and those who live in rural areas. Lawmakers from the Black Maternal Health Caucus has introduced resolutions to Congress recognizing Black Maternal Health Week and bringing national attention to the crisis. And the DOJ has reached a settlement in the 20 cases involving Lafayette Square protesters protesting against racial injustice following the death of George Floyd. The United States Park Police released a new policy that would require officers to be clearly identifiable with visible badges and nameplates on outerwear gear and helmets. The policy also lays out the new guidelines about the use of non-lethal force, such as using de-escalation tactics and seeking approval before using defense equipment. That's some of what you may have missed. Let's watch Grand Rapids as I head there to do the eulogy and stand with that family for justice for this young man, unarmed, shot in the back.